For quite a while, I've been thinking about one of the best revolutionary open-world experiences I've ever played. This game has proven to me that open-world games can be more than just a list of markers and objectives. It traverses into the realm of pure perfection. That game, of course, is Elden Ring, and for quite a while I've been playing it, and I plan to play it a lot more over the coming months. Yet even though this game has taken over my life, I've played a few other games before its release, so I have some things to talk about. The first game on this list is of course Ghost of Tsushima, and despite that trick intro, honestly, I really love this game. I haven't played many open world games quite as good as Ghost. And even though I think there's been a lot of talk about how Elden Ring innovates on open world game design structure, I think that Ghost has some merit in terms of how it perfects the structure that people have gotten so bored of. And so yeah, that summarizes what this video is going to be about. It's not really a review, it's more so me defending Ghost of Tsushima. I think many people think that this game is just as boring as many of the other open world games that have been coming out, but I think this is really wrong. It really innovates and tries to adapt on things that many other games have been getting wrong. So anyways, I guess I'll start off with a discussion on how modern open world games have been structured. I want to preface this section by saying that many of the franchises I will be criticizing are mostly a lot of fun. It's just that with time and lingering neglect, there's a lot of obvious problems that the main structure has. Yet still, these games in the open world genre like Horizon Zero Dawn, Forbidden West, Days Gone, fail to really advance on the open world formula quite like Ghost does. Anyways, in the last few years, monotonous open world games have become very prevalent. Look no further than Ubisoft with Assassin's Creed and Far Cry. Even though I don't hate these games, in fact Far Cry 5, despite being pretty standard in the series, is one of my favorite games in general. All of Ubisoft's new open world titles have grown from shorter and precise experiences to vastly larger yet somehow empty open worlds where the player is encouraged to do so many countless side missions and activities that the main structure begins to suffer. Here's a nice little quote by Jack Sather that I think explains it really nicely.
But I do believe that over the past 10 years, the fundamentals that made Ubisoft such a great titan of gaming have eroded over time. Fundamentals like the ability to innovate.
I don't know why these games think they deserve so much of your time, but in many cases it's just infuriating. Not to mention all of the side activities are just so unconnected and random, they just feel so pointless. Yet sadly, with bad practices such as XP gating, bored gamers are forced to slowly paddle through the muddled mass that is contemporary open world game design. Before Ghost of Tsushima, the last open world game I really remember enjoying and being immersed in is Red Dead 2, and before that maybe like Fallout 4. I've played almost every single open world franchise Ubisoft has to offer, and tons of others like Days Gone and Horizon Zero Dawn, yet sadly I find it so hard for these games to keep my attention till the very end. Unless it's really short like the open world Spider-Man series, I generally find myself bored around the halfway mark. If I just beat a game, assume I really enjoyed it because I don't have time to spend on games that I don't enjoy. Luckily though, I beat Ghost in a grand total of like 60 to 80 hours, and was able to fully complete every main mission, side mission, and side activity that I randomly stumbled across. Even better, all of this progress was completed with pretty limited boredom. I was pretty consistently engaged. Even though I took a bit of a break halfway through before picking it back up to finish, I can say that there's only a few times in which I wasn't really immersed in the world. Compared to games like, let's say, Horizon Zero Dawn, which in my opinion was pretty boring 3 to 4 hours in. There was like some huge info dumps that really slowed down the pacing. Ghost is paced beautifully, except for maybe getting a little sluggish near the middle, and every single mission in and of itself is paced beautifully. It almost like takes inspiration from a TV series type of format. It has nice branching side stories, and the main story is pretty simple, yet allows for all the rest of the themes and motifs to flourish. The combat and ability structure is decent as well, and I really felt as though up to the end I was consistently learning and advancing my skills. The user experience is clear and simple, especially compared to Ubisoft games which have been in the light recently due to the release of Elden Ring. Elden Ring improves on the open world formula by not holding players' hands, yet I think Ghost develops it in a different way, by making the muddled and confused systems much cleaner and simpler. As you can see on the screen right now, many people are comparing Ghost to other open world games that have terrible UI and UX. I've played almost all of these though, and let me tell you, the only one that really doesn't deserve to be on this list is Ghost. Each one of these topics I've briefly mentioned can be elaborated in their own section, so feel free to skip to whichever you want. Timecode's in the description. From start to finish, the level of player engagement is masterful and takes the obnoxious design Ubisoft has been trying to perfect, shines it up a bit, and then spits it back up polished and perfect. So anyways, let's start off by talking about how Ghost of Tsushima improves on the horrendous Ubisoft open world design. As I've already mentioned, the combination of overarching pacing, level design pacing, and second-to-second pacing is great. I will describe this story later, but all you really need to know is that the island of Tsushima has been invaded by the Mongol Empire, and you have to fight Far Cry style to get it back. Through side missions, side activities, and large outpost captures, there are 3 main sections of the map. The first one being the large sort of tutorial and introduction, the middle being the sort of middle section of course, and the final being a sort of finale. A narrative-focused, snowy part that I think works well at both preparing for the ending and giving a sort of natural biome diversity that works really well in open-world games. I think for the most part, the structure sort of naturally limits the immersion one can experience for the game, as filling out the map feels automatically video gamey, but nonetheless all the minute gameplay tweaks such as the subtraction of the minimap, and takes away a lot of unnecessary UI. This limited HUD allows for the frankly robotic structure to be hidden. The large-scale game, through start to finish, is fairly simple, but that's fine. It allows for the smaller and subtle structure to really shine through. There are honestly very few main missions in the game, and you're really just encouraged to explore side activities and side missions, but all the main missions are great because each one genuinely moves the plot forward. I'm so happy to say that there's no boring or meaningless main missions. Also, even though side activities are important to gain more XP and abilities, the XP isn't really too important, and this sort of XP grind structure is completely gone. This single fact alone pushes it one tier above Ubisoft, and all the other elements really push it above the other competitors like Days Gone and Horizon Zero Dawn. You see, the side mission structure is so good, I think most players, even those that typically avoid side content, would really like these. The side missions are one of 2 varieties. There's overarching ones for the 5 to 6 main side characters. Each one of these side characters have their own 8 or so mission long storyline that develops and continues throughout the game. These missions allow you to really explore the world and people of Tsushima, and the 8-episode mission structure makes every side character feel like they have their own sort of TV series. And as somebody who has seen a decent amount of traditional Western and samurai films, especially after beating the game, I can confirm that these story arcs and side content fit the theme beautifully, and doing side content in between main missions doesn't feel like a boring slog, but feels more like a huge addition to the overarching structure. Something you may remember from like 8th grade is this. You see, every side mission goes through this sort of rising and falling action structure like an episode of a TV show. There's an initial introduction, you go to investigate more and learn more on your own, then there's usually some interesting twist or build up, and then one final combat scene that leads into the resolution. It's methodical, but similar to, again, a TV show. In fact, because it feels like a samurai TV show, I was only encouraged even more to experience all the stories and side content. The structure goes for every side mission, and other than those large 8-episode series that I mentioned earlier for the side characters, the small scale structure also works for random one-off missions, and is sort of like a filler episode in between the main series. Some are special mythical tales with really cool art and really interesting stories. Many of them reward you with really special skills and separate content, and every single side mission usually invokes some sort of moral question, typically around family or death. I remember a mission where you have to deal with a father grieving the death of his sons, but it turns out that the one he liked the least survived and never really wants to talk to him ever again for choosing his better brother over him. And then I also remember another one where you have the option to kill bandits that have been terrorizing this woman, but it turns out that they weren't even in the wrong, and if you didn't kill them and stealth through the section, then you get a different ending. I'd love to talk more about the moral questions later, but nonetheless, this is a huge part of the overarching structure that I really love. It all fits together to form these really great themes that continues throughout the entire game. I've described all these side missions and main activities, and I think now a lot of you guys are wondering, why does this matter? Truly, I think it matters when you compare this structure to the Ubisoft structure that I was criticizing earlier. This really shows why Ghost deserves so much more praise and credit. So the structure I've been describing for Ghost is interesting compared to the Ubisoft titles I've mentioned previously in this review. Not only are the side activities completely optional here, but they are pushed towards the player in a much more digestible manner compared to Ubisoft games. The overarching structure of these side missions allow the players to understand the start to end, yet pushes them to really experience the side activities because of how much of a prominent part of the game they are. Ubisoft titles such as the new Assassin's Creed games don't really capture the same charm and structure as Ghost. They're linear but in an uncaring way, and they don't really push the story or themes too far. How the whole idea of XP gating wouldn't really be that much of a hot topic if, you know, the side activities to gain XP were fun to begin with. All they do is add some hours to the runtime. Here's a great quote from Yang Ye that I think describes this dilemma perfectly in the context of comparing Elden Ring to Ubisoft titles.
Even Ghost of Tsushima, which was my game of the year in the year that the game came out, could feel formulaic, but there are so many things that made up for that, like the combat just being amazing, the visuals, especially the way the foliage makes the world feel like it's breathing with how it's constantly swaying, the design of the world, and I like the story personally, and there's so many good facets of that game that made up for the fact that it was somewhat formulaic.
Oh yeah, and I haven't even mentioned the other side activities like fox shrines, haikus, hot springs, temple climbs, and bamboo cuttings that are scattered all around the world. These side activities actually do upgrade your abilities and give XP, and even give some special perks that make them worthwhile. And also, most importantly, they're very short, and the few that are maybe more than 1 minute, like climbing shrines, are some of the prettiest parts of the game. Even though I think there's an overabundance of some of the activities like fox shrines, and not enough of others like bamboo cutting, I was still very entertained throughout, and every single time there was a question mark on my map that likely hid one of these fun activities, I'd make it my duty to discover them before the end of my current session. The last time I really had fun like that, and felt involved in the side activities, was maybe like Watch Dogs 2. Nonetheless, I really didn't go out of my way in any of these games that I've played other than Ghost. As you can tell from the side content to the main content, I think Ghost both works well as a true open world experience, and it doesn't really force you to grind or experience side content, but truly draws in the player by making the side content fun, and with a really great overarching gameplay structure. Not to mention the complex moral dilemmas that I mentioned earlier that really make the themes worthwhile to experience. The player isn't forced to do anything, and the developers instead use psychology and enjoyment to entice players, a practice that somehow has been lost in the open world game format. Now a really important part of the game that I want to talk about is the streamlined and fantastic UX and UI that pushes this game into a different category and subtracts and subdues the repetitive structure that other games have. Especially around the release of games like Elden Ring, we can really see how subtracting mechanics from games make them a lot less boring and tiresome. Really quickly look at this clip right here. As you can see in the top left, that's the only sign of where to go, and around you the wind is all pointing in the direction that you're supposed to be headed. Eventually that sign fades away, and the only thing that's really showing you are the subtle things of leaves and the wind. You can use the controller to blow the wind and show you exactly where you need to go, and then there's very few markers as you can see on screen right there. Hell, even in combat that you're seeing right now, you'd expect there to be a lot of stuff on screen, and even though sometimes it looks like there is, that's because you pull it up. When you're switching your stances, when you're using abilities, it all actually just pulls it up from the side. It doesn't force you to look at these things 24/7, only when you want to look at them and when you want to navigate through the small menus, they let you. It means that during those nice moments, the screen is not cluttered at all, yet when you want to see something, well, you can see it. To those of you who don't know, UI stands for user interface, things like the heads-up display, minimap, and in-game markers, and UX stands for user experience, which is more broad and covers the entire game experience. The entire last segment of this video was a critique of the structure and feel of the game, which contributes to the UX. And so now this segment will discuss the user interface. Now it's no question that many people are just plain tired of the monotonous and repetitive user interface that has been reused over and over again. Surely many games such as Horizon Zero Dawn that you're seeing right now takes people out of the experience with the UI, as everything from the sound, the enemy patterns, and specific cues are all handled with UI. Waypoints and navigation systems are the worst of it. As in some of the best games ever made such as Red Dead 2, even the muddled UI really annoys me. You stare at the back of your horse's head following the line in the bottom left corner of your screen, and it doesn't feel like you're really exploring the world, but like you're just following that line. But anyways, Ghost has no minimap, no horrendous waypoints, no crazy complex health and stamina bars, no egregious ammo counters. In fact, all the specifics like the sword stance you're in, the special tools you have selected, and ammo type you're currently using are all hidden unless you press R2 or L2. So for the most part, as I explained, you're not really hit with this crazy complexities or annoyances in the UI. Also, something you almost definitely know about if you've even barely been following this game is the use of the wind to show the waypoint you've selected. The entire world sways in the direction of your point, giving you a sense of purpose and intuition. It's almost like those visual cues from Naughty Dog games, like the lighting and environment that sort of shows you where to go next. They're doing that, but in an open world stance, which is really weird, but it works really well. Again, even though I don't consider Ghost to be much of an immersive game, I give praise to the developers for tying in every aspect of the game to the world itself. I've tried to describe the specialties and differences between this game and the typical open world formula, to the point where I think you already understand my main idea. This game advances on the formula and gives gamers what they want and what they deserve. It's sad how obvious many of these changes to UI and UX really are, and I hope this game both inspires and encourages other developers to try new things and not stick to the same song and dance has polluted the industry for the past few years. So now I guess I'll transition to what many of you expect from this video, the key analysis of other elements like the story. The main story is filled with many great motivations and themes. The basic summary is that the Mongols have captured and overran a Japanese island, that island of course being Tsushima, and then all the remaining samurais in the island, mostly just the main character Jin Sakai, defend against the Mongol invasion. The very opening shows the defeat of all the samurai on the island, and it's basically just a huge massacre. The opening is really great though because it sets up both sides of the conflict. On one hand, as you can see right here, we have the honorable samurai, the most prominent of which is your uncle, Lord Shimura.
We will face death and defend our home.
Tradition, courage, honor. They are what make us.
Then on the other side, you have the very brutal Mongols, the most prominent figure there being the Mongol leader, Khotan Khan.
I am Harunobu Adachi, descendant of the legendary Yoshinobu Adachi.
As you can see by those two simple clips, one side is honorable and the other is just, brutal. Especially after finishing the game and looking back, you can really see how they set up these motifs very early on. Also, after the beach attack, Jin Sakai basically gets incapacitated, and then your uncle Lord Shimura gets captured, and freeing him from the hands of the enemy is the basic plot point that drives the entire first part of the game. And then for the rest of the game, you're really just pushing back his army along the island. But anyways, one of my favorite moments is right here.
So I'll ask you once again, Samurai. Do you surrender?
As you can see, Khotan Khan basically asks Lord Shimura if he's going to surrender, but he knew what the answer was going to be. Khotan Khan may be brutal, but he's also very smart, and he knows his enemy very well. He knows that Lord Shimura won't surrender, and even though this is a sort of rhetorical and blank question, it does a great job at showing how smart Khotan Khan is, even if he is just a brutal villain. Anyways, the main thing that drives Jin's storyline, the main character, is the moral dilemma of whether or not breaking the samurai code of honor is worth being able to save the island. Your uncle thinks that honor is more important than victory, and even though Jin does follow this to an extent, he still thinks that sometimes breaking the code of honor is important to be able to save people in the island. By the end of the game, you're having to make these huge decisions on this moral question, and they do a really good job at making it somewhat ambiguous. Even though the point of the game is to sort of be the ghost and to be stealthy, they still make it seem like, this isn't the right path always. Each side has its pros and cons. There's repercussions whenever he chooses either side. Throughout the story, they throw things at you and really make you think, which is the right path? Sadly though, there is a sort of disconnect between this and the gameplay, as sometimes the story basically forces you to do stealthy tactics. Because of this, it doesn't really feel like you're choosing your own path, you're more so seeing Jin as he chooses the path. But nonetheless, it's still not done bad per se. It's just if you're looking at something in which you really get to decide the story, this isn't it. But nonetheless, the game doesn't really present itself as something where you choose the story. You're following it like a TV show, so it works. Anyways, my favorite part of the game actually is how it explores morality, relationships, and the hierarchy to an extent that really make you feel and care about the story. It's very simple, yet it's a great drive to push you to explore the island. The best part is that this game takes this idea and explores morality, relationships, and hierarchy to an extent that makes you really feel and care about the story. Something I mentioned in my last Spider-Man Miles Morales video is how well they set up the characters in Ghost. In Ghost of Tsushima, they show that every character has these human-like traits and make mistakes. The mixture between complex characters yet a simplistic story is what allows story-driven games to blossom over the course of many hours. Each character's individual strengths and conflict work together like, well, a television series. You see, every single side character has their own sort of arc. Every single one of them actually has to do with a family member that they're close to, or even multiple family members. And then they have to deal with loss, they have to deal with grief, they have to deal with revenge. But it's not done in a way that alienates these side characters. They're pushed to their limits, but in a way that you can still feel for them. They're still human. This is even mirrored with the main story, as Jin Sakai, for instance, has a friend that's turned to the Mongols. Yet nonetheless, they do this in such a humanizing way. I explained this in my Spider-Man Miles Morales video as well. He also has a complex relationship with his uncle, as I explained. His uncle is very loyal and disapproves of many things that Jin does, but they still have this love for each other. It never feels like anything they do is truly out of hate or anger. It's out of love. They want the other person to survive. I sort of use this in my Spider-Man Miles Morales video, because that game dealt with side characters very poorly. The side characters didn't feel human, they felt like they were just doing things for anger and revenge. Yet in this game, anger and revenge is just how they deal with their emotions of love. I don't know, I can rant on for this for hours as well, but all you have to know is, the side characters are very, very deep, and there's so many great side missions and separate lore and side stories that just rule. And again, every little piece is so well written, all the characters are so good. I can't think of a side character that really made me hate them. Unless I was, you know, intentional. So yeah, this is just an A+ part of the game. Instantly, the stories and side characters levitates this over many other games I've played, and add a lot to the final score that you'll see later. In terms of continual structure that's very well paced, there are very few other series and games that deal with it quite as good as this one. The pacing is methodical in a way that doesn't feel sluggish, so I can sink into the specifics to the fact that I never really minded that I was having to play a longer game. I honestly hate long games, and dragging out stories is terrible. It's a big reason why I don't stick with many games. Many times it feels like they almost need to refresh themselves after a large conflict and add on to what the solid story already had. For instance, this is a big problem that Red Dead Redemption 2 had. Also, some have huge info dumps, like again, Horizon Zero Dawn. Yet Ghost lets a simple story harness a well-paced game with individual aspects to keep the player coming back. The narrative incorporation is similar to something like Last of Us, where the complex characters and morals is what grounds the player into wanting to play till the end, even if the main story is fairly basic. As much as I could rant on about the great structure and story elements that the game introduces, I really want to leave you guys with this. The story for such a long game like this should be the vessel for change and adaptation that keeps people coming back, and Ghost of Tsushima rises far above its adversaries in this respect. It's so groundbreaking in the simplicity that it presents itself, and it's not an absolutely new mind-blowing feat, but a refreshing surge that will give you exactly what you want if you're interested in a morally complex, yet perfectly paced experience. Unlike my other reviews, as you can probably tell, I'm not going to talk about the individual gameplay aspects as much, because as you've likely already seen, that's not the part of the game that I consider to be specifically impressive. Nonetheless, I think the combat, stealth, and general exploration works really well with all the other aspects I've discussed. Despite the title of Ghost, I think the game does gloss over a lot of stealth mechanics. For instance, there's interesting techniques and abilities to learn like the blow dart and distracting bells, but these are either not really too useful or presented very late in the game, so you can't really experiment with them enough. The enemies are usually spread a good amount away, so if you try, it's not that hard to kill them all with stealth. Yet also, there's not really too big of a repercussion if you want to go in guns a-blazing. The combat is very rewarding but forgiving, which I don't actually like. You have sticky bombs, kunai knives, a bow and arrow, heavy bows, explosive arrows, smoke bombs that make you go instantly back to stealth. Even with all these additional things, the combat alone is just perfect with itself. It's sort of like in my Miles Morales review. I didn't really like the invisibility aspect because it sort of was just a cheap out. That's basically exactly what these things are in this game, except they aren't too easy to pull out. In fact, there is a little bit of skill that has to do with them. The only time I really used these abilities was when I was about to die and I really needed to use them or else, you know, I'd lose. Or maybe even at the end of the game, when they started to make the combat a little bit difficult, that was maybe one of the only other times I used it as well. Nonetheless though, all of the abilities usually felt more like a get out of jail free card, not a useful part of your repertoire. Again, I think the sword abilities you get are already really good at pacifying specific enemies. So basically, with the sword you can hold R2 and then switch to one of 4 stances. One is for swordsmen, one is for spears, one is for tough enemies, and one is for enemies with shields. Interestingly, the connection is very distinct, as a pointy triangle of the PS4 controller connects to the spear guys, the anti-shield ability is for circles, the tough men are the square, and the swords are the cross. It really strangely correlates. It works out really well, and I was very easily able to know exactly what ability to use. Each one of these 4 stances can be upgraded, and they have their specific combos that work with the specific enemy type that they're made for. It's sort of like, I don't know, Doom Eternal, where specific abilities are really good for specific enemies. The system works really well, and I wish some abilities were much more specific for specific enemies, and I think I'd like it more if they did that. You can sort of cheese the system and use some moves for some enemies that it's not made for, but nonetheless, this all does add a sort of complexity to the system that I like a lot. They mix things up every once in a while. Also on the sort of get out of jail free card abilities I mentioned earlier, like the kunais, I really just saved up these for the entire game, and I almost always had the maximum amount of the abilities. Oh yeah, and difficulty. I played about half of this game on medium and then the other half on hard. I think on medium, really it's just too easy, and then on hard mode isn't too difficult, but nonetheless I think some things like the boss fights are a little too hard, so sometimes I go down to medium and have fun, and I don't really care about difficulty. I mean, hey, I'm pretty good at some hard games, but at the end of the day, I play many of these just to have fun. The parrying, blocking, and dodging is really fun. Maybe it's a little too telegraphed, like you can really see exactly when they're gonna swing because they have the just light up prompt that they show. But anyways, yeah, the boss fights are pretty fun actually. Many of them are really distinct from one another, but they're pretty standard. They're just, you know, sword duels. It almost feels like a fighting game actually because it turns into like a 2D segment. It's really cool. Healing is pretty simple. You have a circle thing called called Resolve that you collect by killing enemies and doing stuff, and if you press a button you can convert it into health to refill the health that you lost. Also, there's some complexity because there's some abilities that take Renown, wait, not Renown, I'm fucking stupid, that take Resolve to use, so you have to be careful and know exactly when to use a Renown. Fucking not Renown, fucking Resolve. So yeah, you gotta be careful. Stealth and combat combined are really fun, and it's sort of what I like out of maybe like an Assassin's Creed game. And yeah, it does feel a little bit Assassin's Creed-y. Except I will admit, the outposts in this game are pretty simple. There's not really that much of a 3D complexity involved, and in fact, that's actually one of the only downsides. Even though this game is much shorter than Assassin's Creed games, I think that Assassin's Creed bases are a lot more complex and interesting to go through. As I was playing, I wished that they got maybe a little more complex with the layouts. There's maybe 1 or 2 missions where I remember the layouts of the environments being really complex and interesting, but these were just main missions. All the side things are just pretty simple. So yeah, in the next Ghost game, hopefully they make this maybe a little more complex. You feel both stealthy and powerful, but one wrong move can make a small domino effect and making 20 enemies gang up on you at once. You have to be really careful, but nonetheless, exiting stealth never felt like a game over. In my opinion, a really good stealth game makes it feel like, yeah, stealth is really important, but if you fail stealth, it's not like you're instantly dead. You still have some tricks up your sleeve. The horse riding and exploration is a lot of fun. The environments are really pretty. I'm going to talk about that in its own section at the end, because, you know, that's probably the most impressive part of the game for me. But before I talk about those amazing environments, I'd like to really quickly discuss the skill point and skill tree system that's placed throughout the game. Because truly, this is one of the only parts of the game that I think isn't advanced compared to many Ubisoft games that have been coming out. And sadly, I think it holds it back from being a truly amazing game. So let's get right into that. Okay, so basically, the main skill system is alright. There are some unique abilities to select, but for the most part, they don't really change up the gameplay that much, other than a few specific ones that have weird stealth complexities or like combat complexities. For instance, there's this weird skill that actually allows ringing bells to kill an enemy when they find it. Those are basically like those rocks that you throw to distract enemies. But really, other than that, for the most part, I stuck with the ones that buffed my damage, or maybe even lessened the amount of damage that I took. They aren't too noticeable, and I do wish they got a little more creative. The armor is actually interesting as well, and every different armor set does encourage a different playstyle. Yeah, really, it's just if you want to do better stealth, if you want to do better arrow shooting, or if you want to do better combat. The combat is likely the most complex of these structures, and so for the most part, really the best thing to do is just put on a bulky samurai suit and just use that throughout the entire game. Even though I often switched off to, you know, sort of roleplay as the Ghost of Tsushima, for the most part, I just stuck with big, bulky samurai suits. You can upgrade the armor and the weapons with some random junk that you find around the world. In fact, you've probably seen me pick up hundreds of different small things around the world already in this video. I actually will admit really quickly that picking up things is just a simple R2 tap. It's really easy, unlike other games like maybe Horizon Zero Dawn that are a lot more annoying with picking up different things. Oh boy, and now the skill tree system. As you can see in the opening little panel thingy, yeah, there's a lot of fucking different things to do. There are 3 separate pages with multiple different skill trees on them. Early game, you're overwhelmed and you're constantly switching through these different tabs to find the best skill to upgrade. Yet late game, you realize just how little they really matter. There's maybe only like 1 or 2 useful things in every page. These things are just like little combos and moves, yet the rest are just simple stat buffs. I hate it when skill trees mix in stat buffs and actual abilities. Like in my ideal game, every new thing on a skill tree would be its own ability. I think stat buffs sure are useful, especially in terms of the progression from start to finish. But nonetheless, I think it's sort of like a delusion, and they could have maybe just buffed you every time you level up in general. Actually, they might do that already. There might be some, you know, small underlying things. But anyways, I ended up getting every single ability by the end, and I really wish they made it somewhat less confusing. I mean, here's the thing. They made the wind aspect of the game to sort of simplify an annoying aspect of other games. Yet I'm sort of baffled how they didn't find a way around the skill tree system. For instance, they should have just cut out all the fat and put it into one single skill tree. They could lower the rate at which you get points, but at the same time, every skill is so unique that would feel so nice to get every single ability. There's these special abilities, I don't even know the name, I don't care enough to look it up like the other things, are sort of interesting and do use some useful skills. You get these abilities after doing the weird mythic tales that I think I explained earlier. They have those really pretty art things, remember? Yet again, I wasn't really encouraged to use these, other than maybe like the flaming sword at the end of the game. I really never even used these throughout my typical session. They aren't useless per se, like if you really need them and are about to die, they might be able to help you, but nonetheless, they're not that big of a deal for moment-to-moment gameplay. These little things that I'm talking about are pretty minor and they don't absolutely ruin experience, but I think they could be implemented a lot better in the next game in the series. Another side thing I just want to quickly mention is that in terms of upgrading your armor and upgrading your sword and katana and arrows and whatnot, really all that I would do is I'd go maybe multiple hours without upgrading them at all. I'd then go to a shop and I'd upgrade everything a lot, and I think it sort of shows how little it matters. Like, yeah, you get damage buffs, you get, you know, different like speed buffs, I think, but truly you could go hours without noticing a difference. It's sort of really minor. And I think that shows that even though Ghost is a big open world game, unlike the Assassin's Creed titles that have been coming out, it's a lot more simple, and that's why it doesn't benefit from all these skills. Ghost is one of the only open world games I would say that no skill tree system would actually work, and so maybe in simplifying the open world format, you could have found some more interesting ways to implement progression. But I don't know, maybe I'm thinking too highly of this game. I just really want to see a game to completely change up the format. And I know what you're thinking, oh, that's just Elden Ring. Well, not really. I mean, as much as you want to say,
Elden Ring is an amazing new open world game that revolutionizes the genre.
I think of it more as just a Souls game if it was made open world. When I think about Elden Ring, I don't really think of it compared to other open world games, if that makes sense. But hey, if I ever do make an Elden Ring review, then I'll talk about that more. So anyways, as you can tell, I sort of didn't really talk about the gameplay and its specific aspects. For instance, I could have covered stealth and then combat in their own sections, but I put that together because, again, as you can tell from the first half of this video, I'm a lot more focused on how this game fits into the entire genre as a whole. But anyways, now let's talk about probably my favorite part of this fucking game, the world. As I guess I'll spoil the next section, but Ghost of Tsushima is probably one of the most beautiful fucking games I've ever played. So let's get into that. In terms of video game open worlds, it's not only hard to accurately convince the player that the world is real, but that every little thing inside of it is real as well. Some ways games do this is by packing it with density and complex structures like the world of Fallout 4, where I truly felt like it was a radioactive wasteland that needed to be scavenged. I think something that's very important for this realism is making sure that the player can do almost everything that they would want to do in the world, talk to whoever they want to talk to, and go wherever they want to go. Even though Ghost's typical open world structure limits the amount of creativity that the player has with interacting with the world, they still present the world as though it's more alive than almost anything else I've played. As mentioned before, the wind guides you to your destination. It's always a key component to the UI and your surroundings. Due to this integration, the entire environment is always moving in some way. The trees are always swaying, the leaves and flowers are always falling from trees and blowing with the wind. The grass is always swaying with the flow of the world. Not only does the motion make the world feel alive and connected, but it makes you really feel connected to it, especially with other details like how fallen leaves on the ground move with your footsteps. There's so many different types of flowers and environments that do a great job at just making the worlds feel so connected. There's agricultural farms along the coast, and there's fishing villages along the rivers and seas. Whenever you get an overhead view from a mountain or something, the birds and flowering trees make it feel like an active world, other than a small mosaic. The world itself with the clouds and ambiance, whether it's dark or sunny, actually sometimes depends on if you're in stealth or not. So when you're in stealth, the world itself reflects your gloomy nature. Oh, and something I'm surprised I didn't even mention so far are the absolutely insane blood physics. Similar to real life combat, the blood is physically ripped out of the enemy and splattered into the exact direction of your sword. Seeing this absolute mayhem is crazy, but at the same time it's done so beautifully and elegant, especially in stealth. I'd consider the blood in and of itself to be its own art piece in this great game. These details are the greatest feat that Ghost has, as it makes the basic open world feel so alive in the smallest detail. It tricks the mind into thinking that everything's alive, and makes everybody's experience a little different in what they experience and see. Gushing about the world can go so far, and due to compression you probably won't be able to see every single intricacy. The realism that the world presents isn't in its structure. Sure, the characters are very realistic and whatnot, but all of the missions feel exactly like that. They feel like individual missions in an open world. This isn't something that the game is trying to hide. It's open about this. And because of that, the few things that it does try to make incredibly realistic, such as the world and nature, it accomplishes this so well that if you look at any one of these large open world games, for instance that list that I mentioned from the beginning, Ghost World is probably the most beautiful in how it's presented and how it moves around you. Thank you guys so much for watching this review. Let's get to the conclusion. Throughout this review, I've gushed and described all the love I have for this game, yet I think the big defining factor I tried to explain in the beginning was showing how every single aspect of the game either delivers exactly what I wanted, or exceeded those expectations. In doing so, Ghost of Tsushima instantly took a top spot among all the games I've finished. The flowing open world with beautiful nature, the overarching individual story structure, the elegant gameplay. My final score for this game is around an 8.5 out of 10. Not because I think it's better than other open world games, but I think it genuinely expands upon the experience that I assumed I'd be getting. So many elements push it really to be above an 8 out of 10, yet 10 out of 10 experiences are really rare, and the games with this score are usually connected to me on a much more deeper level. Even though Ghost doesn't really strike me as a personal favorite, in terms of logistics and game design, it deserves a lot more praise than I think it's been getting. The monotonous structure of many games is broken down by Ghost, and hopefully other games take part, and inspiration from it, and stop being so damn boring. The sales show that this game's actually done really good, and I think the general acceptance for this game is that everybody that plays it knows that it's one of the best open world titles to come out recently. Anyways, I hope this video convinced at least a few of you that this game really marks a change in the industry. Thank you guys for watching so much. So yeah, as you guys can tell, this video is very, very long, around the 35-minute mark, which is much longer than anything else I've ever made. Yet nonetheless, if you've been watching my recent uploads, not only have I been uploading a lot more, but I've been able to deviate from the standard content, and I plan to do this much more in the future. I do have a few ideas for the next big review I need to do, but I actually haven't really started on the script, and I'm really just waiting for something to come to me. In fact, the last Overwatch video sort of inspired me, and I might make a video or two about just general gaming news in the industry. If you go to my website, you might see a few articles on things like this already, where I talk about things from NFTs, and the implementation of always online gaming ecosystems. Thank you guys so much for watching. I had a great time with this video. Thanks for listening to my ramblings once again. Take care. Ring, ring, ring. Ring, ring, ring. Ring, ring, ring. Telephone!